Use of prayer mats is commonplace in our modern society, but there's a lot of confusion as to whether using prayer mats is a sunnah or a bid'ah and the conditions surrounding their use. At the extreme end of the scale, there are some sects who claim that the use of prayer mats is not allowed at all. However, there are more than 5 strong hadiths which prove otherwise, including a hadith in Bukhari where the Prophet's wife Maimuna, peace be upon him, mentioned that he would sometimes pray next to her on a humrah, which is commonly known to be a small mat made of palm leaves, sufficient in size for the face and the hands during prostration, but it can be a larger mat as well. Another hadith in Bukhari tells us of the time when Anas bin Malik was at his grandmother Malaika's house, where they shared a meal with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and an orphan. After the meal, they all prayed together, and Anas gave the Prophet his hasir to pray on, which is a larger mat, normally longer than the length of a man, made from date palm leaves or straw. Aisha also narrated a hadith where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, prayed on a khamisa, which is a square garment that had marks on it that were diverting his attention away from his prayer. So he asked her to take it to Abu Jahm and exchange it with his inbijaniya, which is a garment without any patterns. So we know from these hadiths and others that it's not only permissible to use prayer mats, but it is a sunnah. Furthermore, the mat does not have to be professionally made, and a wide variety of materials can be used, including animal pelts, rags, clothing, or even palm leaves. However, as we have seen in the last hadith, there are conditions applicable to the use of prayer mats. The Prophet was distracted by the marks on his khamisa, and if he got distracted, you can imagine what happens to regular folk like you and I. Scholars have highly discouraged us from using any prayer mat with markings that may distract us in our prayer, and the modern highly decorative mats definitely fall within these rulings. It also includes any bright and colourful mats, or those with drawn objects such as mosques or the Kaaba. It must be clarified that using one of these distracting prayer mats does not nullify your prayer, but it is considered makruh, or disliked. But the scholars have ruled that using a prayer mat which contains animate images of living beings, such as people or animals, is haram. This is a trick of shaitan. He knows how hard it is to get righteous Muslims to stop praying, so he instead tricks them into purchasing these types of prayer mats and hopes to make their prayer invalid without the person's knowledge. We see this today with a lot of hidden animals, faces, objects, and other occult symbols hidden in to the highly decorative layout of these prayer mats. Now, astute Muslims have found pigs, demons, monsters, phallic objects, the Eye of Horus, Christian crosses, and all sorts of evil images woven into the prayer mat's design. Now, considering the extreme danger of having your prayer invalidated by prostrating to images of false gods or otherwise, it's highly advisable to completely avoid all prayer mats with patterns. It's important to remember that none of the items used by the Prophet, peace be upon him, to put something between him and the ground during prostration in prayer were designed specifically for praying on. There's no such thing as a prayer mat in the time of the Sahaba. And if you possess the belief that it's compulsory to use a prayer mat, then you hold a belief which is outside of Islam, one that there's no evidence for, and one that none of the Sahaba possessed. In considering these factors, it's beneficial to stop using prayer mats altogether, to avoid falling into bid'ah, where the prayer mat becomes an essential item held onto ritualistically in your prayers, or where you developed strange beliefs, such as it not being allowed to pray directly on the ground. To give you a personal example that I've experienced, once I was at someone's house, and this person is very obsessive about using their prayer mats. In fact, they have a large collection of them ready for the use of both themselves and guests at the house. Now, sometime in the afternoon I went for my prayers, and I was praying on the ground, and they saw me and panicked, making some remarks before they rushed in and placed a prayer mat underneath me while I was in the middle of my prayer. And these are some of the extremes that people can go to. Rulings on the use of prayer mats in mosque are even more strict, but we have direct hadiths informing us that it is considered bid'ah. It was narrated when Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi spread out a rug in a mosque in Medina, and Malik ordered for it to be taken away and stated that spreading a rug in their mosque is bid'ah. We also have multiple narrations showing us that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not use any prayer mats in the mosque, which was open to the rain and the floor was made of dirt. He did this even though he had full access to a range of mats, cloths, beddings. For example, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri told us of the time during Ramadan when the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, led the prayers at the mosque just after it had rained. And he prostrated in the mud and the water, which remained on his face even after he arose. So when is it allowed to use a prayer mat? Well, when there's a need for it. I'll give you an example. When I'm visiting the house of my two young nieces, sometimes I'll be walking around and I'll step in a pile of urine, since they're at that age. And it's hard to see when it's wet. But what if it's dry? Or it's just about dry? And I go down and pray in it. So when we have a concern that there are impurities on the ground, using a prayer mat is advised in those instances. Considering many of the Sahaba used to live in the desert, there would be times when the floors of their homes were very dirty and dusty, and they may have wanted to cover an area so they are not breathing it in and choking during their prayers. And there may be a myriad of other reasons, but the same principle applies. If there's a genuine need for it, then use a mat of some sort. Now, when praying outside or in an open mosque exposed to the weather, we know that praying in the rain or the mud is a sunnah, but in the opposite conditions, such as extreme heat, when the ground is too hot to touch or to prostrate on, you may want to use a mat to facilitate your prayer. We have a confirmation on this from a hadith narrated by Anas bin Malik, where he mentioned that they used to pray with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the scorching heat, and when the ground was too hot to bear, they used to spread their clothes before them, such as a turban. So in summary, it is better to avoid purchasing and using professional prayer mats. And in the times when you do need something to separate yourself from the ground in prayer, stick to the sunnah and use garments such as cloaks and turbans or small cloths or household mats. But while your prayer is still valid if you do use a prayer mat without animate or evil drawings, be very careful of developing a case of prayer mat bid'ah, and please remember the warning of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in one of the previously mentioned hadiths, where he was afraid of the mat's markings putting him into a trial. So for the sake of Allah, if you avoid using the professionally made prayer mats, you will successfully avoid these issues. Assalamu alaikum.